Okay, and we are live. Hello, everybody out there across the plane. It's a beautiful day here on the East Coast. Hope you guys are all having a great day. We're going to do Season 2, Episode 4 of Static Plain Truth Live. With me today so far, I've got my good close friend, Brian Stage. Brian, how you doing, bud? I think Brian's muted, so that's cool. Oh, and we just got Robert to join. Hey, Robert, how's it going, bud?
Hey man, how's it going? Did you guys go live yet?
Yep, we're live. We've got a few viewers piling in, so just for the next couple minutes, we'll let everybody sort of pile in. And I
Yeah,
got a, huh?
no, I unmuted myself and
Oh,
the shake the rust off of doing all this. And thanks for inviting me back.
yeah, it's been a while. It's good to have you back, man. And we've got some really interesting topics to talk about today. Um, I'm going to start off just with sort of a little monologue while everybody piles in. We should have some more panel members and, of course, some more live viewers. But um, let me go up to the top here. And, the internet, and especially YouTube, has been taken by storm regarding this whole flat Earth matter, especially over the last year or two. Unfortunately, the simple phrase flat Earth carries with it a lot of stigma or negative connotations that will sort of make your average person, step back a few paces from you and look at you like you're crazy.
Yep.
Um, we've collectively been conditioned to scoff at the idea as ridiculous and anti-scientific and all that. While there is indeed a great deal of physical evidence and experimentation to support and even, yes, prove the fact that standing water, for example, possesses exactly zero point zero degrees of curvature over dozens of miles, 50 miles, and even over 100 miles, if you're talking about radio tower shots, which would be physically impossible if the Earth was a sphere. I've stated this before, but the simple lack of curvature over such distances, especially with standing water, is sufficient to debunk the notion that we live on a ball. This is really important, but we could just as easily call this stationary Earth revelation independently of the flat Earth revelation. So, in other words, the fact that this puppy is stationary is just as good a proof of as the lack of curvature is. The reason being is the commonly accepted theoretical physics of our so-called planet and so-called universe demands constant motion. The amount of motion involved with the heliocentric theory is just mind-boggling and beyond incomprehensible. One of the reasons I named this show Static Plain Truth is to sort of avoid that stigma attached to the phrase flat Earth. And the title of the show encompasses the fact that the world doesn't move at all. When people hear static, they think of electricity, but in fact the word static technically means motionless, or to be exact, we'll just go with Webster. Static is an adjective, and the very first definition is lacking in movement, action, or change, especially in a way viewed as undesirable or uninteresting. For example, demand has grown in what was a fairly static market. Static prices, and an antonym would be variable. Then the second definition is physics concerned with bodies at rest or forces in equilibrium. So I find this all rather amusing because physics is literally the study of bodies in motion. So how ironic could something possibly be where the world is full of very brilliant, educated physicists, theoretical or otherwise, who never really took the time to apply their specialty to the very ground which they've always walked upon. The amount of pre-programming that goes into our worldview is so pervasive and begins at such a young age that we unwittingly see and experience what we believe to be possible as opposed to objectively studying what we actually see and experience. Just as proving the world or vast stretches of standing water don't curve as they should if the Earth was indeed a sphere, this conclusively shows that all theoretical physics branching from the heliocentric hypothesis are unfounded and therefore null and void. So too is the fact that the world is demonstrably stationary or static. In other words, proving the world to be stationary is 100% conclusive evidence to demolish the same theoretical physics branching from the heliocentric hypothesis. Just to name a few really important points showing the world to be static are the North Pole star Polaris, the lack of disparity in terms of centrifugal forces at the poles versus at the equator, which should be infinite, the disparity that is. And one of my favorites, I call it the Jernin effect, which is just such a blatant, obvious problem with the heliocentric model, yet somehow all of the pro-ball astronomers totally missed this for hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, won't they feel stupid when they realize how simply and completely the heliocentric hypothesis is discredited and debunked? Now, first off, and this is a big one, the North Pole star Polaris remains fixed above the magnetic North Pole, also known as the axis of rotation in the hypothetical non-existing spherical Earth model. Polaris is supposedly 433.8 light years away, which converted into miles renders a number which I honestly don't even know how to read, or more easily converted into the theoretical astronomical unit. So 1 AU, or 1 astronomical unit, is the theoretical distance from the Earth to the Sun in the heliocentric model, or about 93 million miles. So if 1 AU equals 93 million miles, Polaris is 27,433,979 times further than the Sun is from the Earth, or 27.4 million astronomical units, which is just, you can't even fathom that. Now, and we really can't blow past this number.
You say that to people, though, and they're like, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Right, right.
No, really, think about it.
So if you consider the fact that the Earth's axis is supposedly fixed to point in the same direction at all times, it still makes zero sense that we could have a single star above that axis given the motion and the changing angles involved with the spherical Earth hypothesis. So to break this down in basic terms, the Earth supposedly spins on its axis once per 24 hours, orbits the Sun at about 66,600 miles an hour, and the Earth and Moon supposedly orbit the Sun around essentially the same plane. It's called the ecliptic. Keep that in mind. Now, while the Earth and the Moon and most of the other planets allegedly orbit the Sun around this ecliptic, the Sun is supposedly racing around the center of the galaxy at nearly 500,000 miles an hour along a different supposed plane than the ecliptic, roughly adhering to the so-called theoretical galactic plane or galactic equator. So at this point we have two planes of orbit, the ecliptic or solar plane and the galactic equator or the galactic plane. Now here's the kicker. The ecliptic plane, that's where the Earth supposedly goes around the Sun, according to mainstream physics is set into the galactic plane at a 60-degree angle. Now, I really have a hard time understanding how the ecliptic remains at a 60-degree angle to the galactic plane, or the path of the Sun around the galactic plane. It's as if all the laws of motion and physics, inertia, conservation of energy, momentum, all of these laws must be sort of broken in order to allow for the theoretical galaxy and orbital mechanics of our little theoretical solar system to be possible. In fact, such things are impossible. But that isn't even the point. The point is, for half of each year, visible space should be north of the galactic equator, and the other half of the year, visible space should be south of the galactic equator. Furthermore, the supposed alleged axis of the Earth is purportedly regressing in a great circle over about 26,000 years. This is what they claim is responsible for precession of the equinoxes. Now, this means that the supposed axis of rotation of the world should be constantly phasing away from one North Star towards another. There's no possible way for a single star to remain fixed above this theoretical axis for more than 50 or 100 years at the very most. The fact is that the North Star has been fixed in its very same spot for all of modern recorded history. Are we to believe that the North Star travels trillions of light years every year just to remain fixed above our North Pole? No, the Earth is stationary, and the apparent stars are apparently moving overhead just as they appear to be. Now, just to cap this point off, the galaxy itself, along with all the other motion described previously, is supposedly traveling some millions of miles per hour through the cosmos, yet we never see any minute change in the perfectly predictable, perfectly cyclical cycles of the stars in the sky, which never change one iota, not a bit. We should so obviously see changes from season to season due to the angles involved with visible space and this whole heliocentric mishmash of crap, but we'll get back to this in a bit. The shameful truth is the North Star's stationary behavior completely falsifies the heliocentric model, as it would be physically impossible to have a single star remain above our alleged axis for any significant amount of time. Now, a few more quick points about Polaris. One is the fact that an observer anywhere in the northern hemisphere, or central semiplane, can view the North Star Polaris at all times, as long as it's nighttime. The same cannot be said about a single star or even entire constellations in the south. Also, Polaris has been documented as visible from as far south as the Tropic of Capricorn. This would be physically impossible if the Earth was a sphere, as an observer's line of sight towards the heavens would be a tangent to the curve of the Earth, and Polaris should not be visible south of the equator at all. And so we have yet another very important verifiable proof that the heliocentric model is dead wrong. Now, another important point about this world being stationary, I mentioned this real quick, is the lack of disparity in centrifugal force at the equator versus the poles. This is yet another physical impossibility involved with the globe Earth. It's the lack of disparity between the poles and the equator in terms of centrifugal force or spinning. Because the Earth supposedly spins once per 24 hours, people argue that the RPMs, or rotations per minute, isn't high enough to generate any significant centrifugal force. This is obviously hogwash, as an observer standing at the equator would theoretically be racing due east at 1,037.5 miles per hour. It's much faster than the speed of sound, while simultaneously dropping vertically at about 135 miles an hour. Gravity would need to be extremely powerful to negate such a dramatic centrifugal force. Can you possibly imagine trying to walk around on the sides of an upright spinning sphere? It would be impossible without some fairly sturdy change fastening us to such a rotating frame of reference. So we take for granted that gravity is this imaginary theoretical force which allows for such a breach in logic and physical laws as to walk around on the side of an upright spinning sphere. But what about the poles? What should the disparity be between the equator and the poles in terms of this non-existing centrifugal force? Well, at the equator, the observer again is perpendicular to the axis of rotation, theoretically, nearly 4,000 miles from the supposed axis beneath their feet, zipping east over 1,000 miles an hour and vertically falling 135 miles an hour. Now, if gravity is supposedly applying itself evenly to all points of this theoretical sphere, then how does that affect a similar observer at the North Pole, for example? At the North Pole, the observer would theoretically be standing on top of the axis, parallel with the axis, and spinning exactly, well, half the speed as the hour hand on a clock. Now, many mathematicians have attempted to apologize for this lack of disparity in centrifugal forces between the two locations by using lengthy formulas and equations to show that the disparity between these two locations wouldn't be all that great. It would be minuscule. And the reason they do this is because there is indeed a minor difference in weight on a scale. You know, if you take a 1-pound object at the equator, it'll weigh a little bit less there than it does at the North Pole. Now, this happens to be directly in line with barometric pressure. The barometric pressure in the north, or the center, is much higher than it is at the equator, and this is measurable. Barometric pressure is highest in the north, gradually diminishing as you approach the equator, and continues to decrease past the equator way to the southernmost latitudes. Now, this minor fact is a pretty big problem for the globe Earth, because you would expect to see some sort of bilateral symmetry between, the North Pole and the South Pole, or like a mirror image from the southernmost areas to the northernmost areas. However, this is obviously not the case, in terms of barometric pressure at least. Now, far northern summers are much warmer, the winters are milder, and the permafrost is essentially nothing compared to that of the South, which is massive glaciers and permafrost that never goes away. The South Pole, with its extremely low barometric pressure, is colder on average and by record than the North. So, furthermore, there's no indigenous wildlife except for possibly penguins in the South. The South polar area is absolutely not in bilateral symmetry with the North, which again is just sort of a little problem for the globe Earth hypothesis, as we should see very similar climates in the North Polar region and the South. Finally, and I'm almost done with my little monologue here, but visible space from winter to summer, using the same basic geometry and logic that I mentioned regarding Polaris, the same sort of thing applies here. The fact is, it's so blatantly obvious, it's astonishing to me, because none of the brilliant astronomers throughout history noticed this glaring problem with the heliocentric model. If the Earth is orbiting the Sun at a 60-degree angle to the Sun's path around the galactic center, or the galactic equator, then half of each year visible space should be, say, northwest of the galactic equator, and 6 months later visible space would be southeast of the galactic equator. You can model this out, it's pretty obvious. Now, this means that the entire world should see a unique set of stars at night during each season, and as the Sun slowly makes its way around the theoretical curve around the galactic center, our angle of attack towards visible space should be slightly different from year to year. And we should discover unique stars and constellations every few generations due to the mechanisms or the nuts and bolts of the heliocentric system. The obvious fact is the stars go around Polaris in a perfect, predictable cycle. Eclipses occur in perfect, predictable cycles. Even as a child, I found this all very hard to swallow from a heliocentric standpoint. And the more you learn, the more and more you learn about the heliocentric model and the accepted version of reality, the more preposterous it seems to get. For example, I always assumed that the planets had sort of a chaotic orbit, just based on the amount of motion involved and the nature of what gravity is supposed to do. Gravity is supposed to be sucking in towards the Sun at all directions evenly. So seriously, how can all the planets remain neatly fixed to the ecliptic, set into the galactic plane or the path of the Sun's travel at a 60-degree angle, going around in circles around the Sun, as the Sun travels nearly perpendicular to the orbital path of the planets at almost 500,000 miles an hour? If gravity was indeed this central sucking or central pulling force towards the center of the Sun, you would expect all sorts of wild acrobatics from the so-called planets in their orbit due to the motion involved. But of course, gravity somehow allows for the impossible to occur, out of line with logic, physics, and common sense, yet again. So this whole situation just oozes irony to me, as the theoretical physicists throughout history have been mathematically brilliant, imaginative, and persuasive, yet lack simple common sense, it would seem. The scientific paradigm, or scientism, has an Achilles heel, which is simple logic and common sense. So, with that, let's open it up to the panel, and I did, we gained a Fran Anderson and a Jason. So we'll start with Fran. How you been, Fran? And Fran,
I had my mic muted. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great. How you been?
I've been good, thank you. Really glad I got the invite this time. I haven't been getting the links.
Yeah, I had a few people complaining. I think Google's messing with me because when you start a Google Hangout, you can send out invites through the Hangout, and it always worked before. But yeah, I had a few people complaining that they weren't getting them, so I've changed my strategy, and I'll just manually email the links out from now on. But I'm glad you made it. What you been up to? You got any videos coming out, or did I miss your last one? It's been a while since I talked to you.
No, you haven't missed any. I'm just working on a new one. You know, they take me a while to make, and I took a break for a while. I kind of needed to just step away for a little bit because um, I think everybody knows how obsessed I can be, and it was kind of taking over my life, and I kind of just needed to step back for a while. But I am working on another video, and it's called "Well, Burst My Bubble."
Yeah,
So
no,
that's the title of my new one.
I totally agree. It's sort of all-consuming, right?
It does. I'm very focused and very, I go off on tangents a lot. I've kind of talked about before how I kind of get distracted. There's just so many tangents you can take when you're doing this research, and I kind of find that that's kind of a problem for me. So then, like, I intend to do a more focused video, and then it's probably going to turn out to be like another hour-long video that goes on many different levels. It's hard for me to stay on one level usually, but I'm trying to focus on geology. I'm still trying to focus on typography, geography, and geology, and things like that. So I'm trying, but I do find I'm taking tangents along the way. But you know, and another thing with me too, and my approach is I look at things very visually. So I spend a lot of time looking at graphics and things, and sometimes I get lost when I'm perusing through all these images. I get kind of sidetracked and everything, and but I'm finding lots of really good information on the internet. One of the things I'm looking at right now is the whole Magellan thing, looking at some of the early maps that were based off of his work and kind of comparing that to what we know about geography today. So kind of just looking at things from that angle, and yeah, all sorts of stuff. You know, you were kind of talking a little bit ago about orientation, and orientation is another thing that I've been trying to research, and it's really hard because it's really hard to easily find things on the internet that provide an actual working model of the current alleged system, complete with the way the shadows would be and where the moons are, and it's hard to find anything that's accurate and good. So I've been trying to kind of work on that whole where the shadows should be on the planets, and where their orientation should be and everything like that, and I'm having a hard time cross-referencing for that. So I have a feeling there's a reason why I can't do that.
No, that's so true, because I've never researched the heliocentric model more in my entire life than I have in the last year. And it's like you find so many different answers for the same thing. I still can't pin down exactly how fast they allege the galaxy is traveling through space. I keep running into 1.34 million miles an hour, but then you'll find other sources that say, no, it's 2 million or it's 100 million. And so it is difficult, but yeah, you'd think that they'd have answers for all of this. But you're right. I mean, it's almost as if they just pick a number that they feel like it works until they find a better number, and they just change it. And you mentioned geology. One of the things that I ran into a lot is people saying, oh, well, tectonic plate movement proves the globe Earth, right?
Not at all.
Which is so ridiculous.
Not at all.
It works better on a flat plane, actually.
Right.
It does. It does. And so I've been doing a lot of moon studies and kind of comparing again, because my last video I talked about some of the similarities between the surface of the moon that we see and the flat Earth map, and making correlations. And I'm still working on making correlations, and I'm always finding more. And so it's like this rabbit hole that I get lost in while I'm doing that, and working in Photoshop a lot, trying to come up with some graphics that I think will help people visualize these correlations that I'm finding between the typography of the flat Earth map and the face of the moon that we actually can see. So I'm still doing more of that. And, you know, you know, you talk about how they don't have a lot of answers, and I was doing some research just the other day, and I ran across on astronomymagazine.com astronomy's 50 greatest mysteries, and some of their greatest mysteries were, it's still astonishing to me that they even consider it a mystery. One of the mysteries, for example, is how did the moon form? And this is something I had talked about in one of my other videos, but I still just, it just never ceases to amaze me that we supposedly been there and back how many times. You know, we have moon samples, and it's our closest neighbor. We've been all around, but we don't know how the moon formed.
Right, and I've seen everything from it was like an errant planet that somehow found its way into the sun's gravitational pull or whatever, then it crashed into a young sort of volcanic Earth, and that's what supplied our water and different, you know, elements. It's all theory, of course, but yeah, they don't even know how this moon formed, and yet we have this perfect relationship with our moon where it's in this geosynchronous sort of orbit where we only ever see one face of it, and you know, science just chalks that off as a big coincidence. Oh, it's tidal locking, you know, that happens all the time. But if you think about the mechanics involved with this, I mean, that would be very, very difficult, like one in a gazillion to have a moon that
do you have any idea when is the oldest actual photograph of the moon? Because I suspect that the moon looked a lot differently, you know, a couple hundred years ago, and those so-called craters that we see from the side of the moon that we only ever see. I mean, it's only visible at a 90-degree angle from our point of view on Earth. So to me, it kind of looks like maybe in the Ancient of Days, 1,000 years ago or something or more, 5,000 years ago, maybe they shot rockets or something at it, or did some kind of like attack on the moon or something, and maybe the moon used to look a lot differently.
And I'm just so confused as to what exactly the moon is, because one thing that I was really sort of taken aback by was if you look at really high altitude weather balloon footage or even the so-called SpaceX rocket launches, if you ever see the moon up above our atmosphere, which sort of acts like a lens, I believe, it's very tiny. It's very dim and tiny and almost as small as the other stars, which you can't see. But
Right.
From the ground, it's just as big as the sun. And to me, it's almost as if you know, our eyes are being tricked by the atmosphere acting as sort of a lens or a magnifying glass that allows us to see really, really good detail on the moon. And you know, you think of things like Polaris. I mentioned earlier, they say it's 433.8 light years away, or 27 million times further than the sun, and yet we can see it with the naked eye. I mean, to me, that's just so ridiculous, but that's the accepted version of reality. Fran, you had mentioned Magellan. Now, if I'm not mistaken, he was commissioned by royals to circumnavigate the Earth, right?
That's right.
Much like Columbus was commissioned by royals to find, you know, a shortcut to the east coast of the Indian continent, right, or Japan. But it's almost as if these royals knew that there was something else over there, and they kept sending people over to find it. And lo and behold, there's America. Some people say that's the biblical promised land. I don't know, but yeah, how did the moon form? That's a good one. I've heard lots of theories.
Oh, and to answer his question about the oldest moon picture, I kind of did a little research on that before, and there was that old telescope that supposedly took a picture of the moon, but then I couldn't find any more pictures with that same telescope, which I found really suspicious, so I kind of ruled that out because I didn't find it trustworthy, since I couldn't find any other pictures from that same telescope. And then the only other pictures that I could find that were, you know, pretty vintage or pretty old were all illustrations, because they were pre-photography.
Right.
And the only problem with those is that they're illustrations, and you never know, like, if you try to use it as evidence, if it'll be ruled out because they'll say, well, that was an
Well,
artistic
do the
mistake.
illustrations show craters?
Yes, yeah, all the illustrations show um, those craters that are like the marinas, like they show the marina, the dark spots, and then all the illustrations also include those ones with the bursts coming out of them. So from what I can tell, a lot of these marinas did exist for a long time, but it looks like there has been a shift in the marinas via these illustrations. But again, I'm not sure if I would be able to,
Trust it.
yeah, trust it or be able to make like a strong case.
Right.
Because if
Right.
I try to make a case with it,
I
somebody
think it's still
would
enough
say, well, the
evidence.
artist made a mistake. Whereas like a photograph, people are like, oh, well, cameras don't lie or don't make mistakes.
Right.
But people that make illustrations do.
So there might be small little differences in the artistry, but I think it's good enough proof to so that the craters and all the different trenches and stuff were there when the guy drew that picture. So
Well, and it's funny too because if you look at, and I'm certainly no expert in Hindu religion, but I have looked at it a little bit, and part of their belief system, part of their religion is that at some point in the past there was this giant war in the heavens, and they had everything from massive bombs, or they described like bombs and laser beams and that sort of thing in their ancient texts. And if you look at this from a biblical perspective, they say, during our generation, if you believe that this is sort of like the end time generation, that there's, even though we think all this stuff is new, that there won't be anything new under the sun. Which to me says, these ancient cultures that were building massive pyramids and just building these structures that we really don't know how they did it, perhaps they were enlightened, or perhaps they had help, or perhaps they had technology that we're not privy to, that we don't know about. And maybe it's because they didn't have their heads shoved up their rears thinking they lived on a spinning globe, and they
yeah,
understood more about the earth than we do,
yeah,
perhaps.
yeah. I think they just definitely had a lot higher advanced technology. I mean, think about how much more advanced we would be if we were using some of the Tesla-based technology, and we've been innovating it for the last 100 years. But no, that's all squashed.
Well, see,
So
the thing is, I think we have. I really think that we've been using Tesla technology. However, they've tricked us into thinking that we need satellites to achieve this technology, which we really don't. Worldwide communications, cell phones, internet, GPS or geo positioning system, not global. All that was possible with Tesla-based technologies and schematics and inventions. And it seems to me like what happened is when he died, the United States federal government essentially commandeered all of his, all of his intellectual property, and then essentially released a heavily redacted version of what Tesla was doing to the world. And then right after that, it was right after Tesla where you start seeing this inundation with sci-fi, infinite space, science fiction, aliens, space travel, Lost in Space, Star Wars, Star Trek. All of this stuff came out. It seems to me as a sort of, preparing the world for space travel, and it worked. They tricked people into thinking that we needed billions and billions of dollar space programs to achieve what Tesla had essentially, achieved with ground-based systems. So, yeah, I think we've been using Tesla technology for 50, 60 years.
I think though, if the technology was kind of available to the public in the public
Oh, open
domain,
source, right? Yeah, absolutely. Open
that
source is
I mean,
always better.
we would have been able to progress that technology a lot farther in this time. But we're all, like you said, we got our heads up our rears, and nobody's thinking about it. They're just happy with the fact that their cell phone works. And most people, if you ask how a regular telephone works, they can't describe. They don't even know how. And I'm like, yeah, the sound vibration goes through the wire. But what about the cell phone? And so they're just walking around happy that it's working and not really caring how it
Yeah,
works.
it's so funny because that's exactly what Brian and I were talking about before the show. It's like we can describe, like you say, electromagnetism, or even a simple magnet. We can describe what's going on, and we can put labels on it like positive and negative, and we understand how to manipulate a magnet with a copper coil or whatever to create electricity. But the mechanisms of it, like what is actually going on inside there, is very very much theoretical. So Brian, first of all, how you been, man? And it's so funny that Robert said that 'cause we were just talking about this. Um, Even light or electromagnetism, we sort of understand it. We can see things, and we can play with magnets, and we can generate electricity, and we can put labels on all the little observations that we've made about how it works, but do we really know what's going on inside there, right?
Well, yeah, you get down to just to get people to define what a photon is, and I'd probably challenge anyone to describe in just layman's terms or even scientific terms what a photon is, without getting to the point where it's a theoretically based item that has to have some model to get a numerical application to fit into a formula and apply to some physics equation.
A
And
photon is one of those things that you sleep on when you go over to your friend's house.
that's, oh, that was good.
Isn't
Brian,
it?
Brian, you had mentioned that they say, oh, it's an elementary particle. So I looked up elementary particle, and here's the definition of elementary particle.
John, do a screen share while you do this, because just keep clicking away start with the elementary particle and see how far you go.
Okay, hold on, let me.
Yeah, do the screen share because it's just hysterical.
Okay, if I can.
By the way, while he's doing that, the mapping of the moon that I share with Fran, that's trying to get old pictures and beyond 1960s, I couldn't find any photographs whatsoever. And the mapping of the moon, the art is called selenography, S-E-L, I think E-N, selenography. And it goes back, to BC times, but the maps have changed dramatically, or they're not uniform throughout. So again, is it the person's perception? Is it that there's dynamic things changing with the moon, or what's really going on? But I agree that the moon today is probably nothing what it was, even 50 years ago. And it gets to be pretty difficult to find out what the origin was, what it looked like or what it appeared like.
Yeah, and of course, physics doesn't really have a good answer for that either, because our moon, in relation to the Earth, is really, really big. Like, if you look at the other so-called planets and their so-called moons, the moons are very, very tiny compared to the host planet, whereas our moon is only, 6 times smaller, or we're 6 times bigger than the moon. So there's lots of wild theories, and I think that the really prevailing one is that some errant planet or dead planet crashed into Earth millions of years ago, and that's how we got the moon. But of course, that's just theory. It's never going to be verified, never falsified, and yet it's written in science books as if it's that's probably what happened. Now, in terms of elementary particles, whew boy, in particle physics, an elementary particle or fundamental particle is a particle whose substructure is unknown. Thus, it is unknown whether it's composed of other particles. So basically, right off the bat, if you look at the definition of elementary particle, which they say is like photons and quarks and that sort of thing, is basically, we don't fucking know, right? So known elementary particles include the fundamental fermions, quarks, leptons, antiquarks, and antileptons, which I would say are theoretical, but they say which generally are, quote, matter particles and, quote, antimatter particles, as well as the fundamental bosons. It just goes on, but at the beginning, they pretty much sum it up. They don't know.
But again, that's the start point for theoretical physicists, is to have a grasp and knowledge of what elementary particles are. So all these guys who boast about, the calculations and theories and everything else, they have to have a fundamental grasp of what elementary particles are, and it just gets into this memorization game of what people think it is, and what it actually is who knows. But again, I just tried to find out what electromagnetic radiation was, and from an engineering standpoint, kind of look at what the units are for the equations, and the the equations include a lot of the theoretical values of unknown things, where even the concepts get with very little foundation. And again, look up electromagnetic radiation. Yeah, you've got it. And there you go. Yeah, just start reading that, and that's the fundamental things when people say, "Oh, I know what electromagnetic radiation is." Okay, this is what you know. Okay.
Yeah, I've always been, just as long as I can remember, learning very early on that photons were particles of light that hit your eye. And I always thought that that sounded really stupid for some reason. But when you get down to brass tacks, the whole idea of atoms and electrons and all of this, the numbers work. And it's in the science book, so people memorize that, and they say they know all about atoms and electromagnetic radiation or elemental particles or whatever, but all they know is what they've read, and what they've read is simply people observing things and putting labels on them. But again, getting down to what's actually going on, it's just theory, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's all based on assumption.
Yep.
Right.
So,
and like the photon, that you look at the units that the photon is, and they give it a mass equivalent. So now you think, okay, this is something I can physically touch. And now they're saying light is something you can physically touch. And now you get into Einstein's theory of relativity and bending of light, because they presume it's a particle. And because it has mass, that it can alter its direction. And again, when I was just trying to find out what the heck electromagnetic radiation is, I couldn't get past the front door trying to figure out what it is they're even talking about. Is it a particle or a wave? Well, we think it might be both, or it could be neither one. Okay, that's great. So again, just trying to find out the rudimentary foundation for half these things, I couldn't get out of the start box.
Right.
Again, I was just trying to figure out, taking the sun and the moons as lenses to try and figure out, the application and how that might affect tides. But I, get past the basic concepts, and you get lost, or I got lost.
well, I have, this is just my theory, and what do I know, right? But I see the tides as being formed just simply by the sun coming through and heating up the atmosphere, heating up the water, and then the moon coming through, and it's cooling down and recompressing, and you've got this sort of decompression and recompression. Decompression is just from heating and cooling. I think that that's a very cogent explanation for tides. And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to trail along with the moon. I mean, water is fluid, and so there's going to be some variances in it. I think that's a very, good possibility that tides are just simply caused by the heating and cooling of the atmosphere and water. Now, electromagnetic radiation, you go into the wiki and it's just so convoluted. Electromagnetic radiation, or EMR, that also stands for electronic medical records, I know that, is the radiant energy released by certain electromagnetic processes. Certain electromagnetic processes, that's the key. Visible light is an electromagnetic radiation, or so they say. Other familiar electromagnetic radiations are invisible to the human eye, such as radio waves, infrared, and X-rays. Classically, the electromagnetic radiation consists of electromagnetic waves, which are synchronized oscillations of electric and magnetic fields that propagate at the speed of light through a vacuum. Now, this is something interesting to me, the speed of light through a vacuum. I've been looking for lightning for the last few months, and I haven't seen any until the other day. And I saw a bunch of it. And I was really observing it like I've never done before. And I can clearly see, maybe you guys can confirm this, and we've got other panel members we haven't even introduced yet, but I could see the lightning drawing and then redrawing out to where it disappeared. So I could physically, see just from the cloud to the ground, the lightning drawing and then redrawing out to where it disappeared. Now, if that was going at light speed, how could my eye pick up on that going from, the cloud to the ground? That should be instantly. So, and then if you look at, well, how fast is the speed of light? There's so many different answers, and I believe that the agreed upon reality is that the speed of light is constantly diminishing or slowing down, right?
Well, go real quick to speed of light in Wiki. And yeah, okay, you apply your jokes for using Wiki as a resource, but just look here for the history and how they determine the speed of light and how far do you get before it just becomes laughable, because they don't even know what they're measuring. And if I remember right, well, you've got it there, but they're trying to figure out how long it took for light to reflect off of one of Jupiter's moons. And, for the time for it to get back and the propagation it took, and then they put numbers to it. Well, let's go a different direction and look at, well, how did they name Jupiter's moons? And then you start realizing that it falls into more of a mythology. And again, I think everyone at the table now kind of realizes the duality of the world and the kind of the silliness that we're all in. And, again, the speed of light, where the construct was when they originally determined it, was more mythological than it was a measurable item.
So what in the hell does this mean? That's what I was trying to figure out, how many miles away is Polaris? So it's 433.8 light years, and this is the number it comes back with, 2.55015 E plus 15.
It's a lot of futons.
I don't even think light can go that far. I mean, it propagates and just to the point where it's dissipated, and
it should diffuse right over that distance. So yeah, there's no way. Right. It's just so ridiculous. Now, real quick, while I'm still thinking about it, we've got Jason here. Jason, sorry to keep you on mute so long. How you been doing, man? Are you still with us? There you are. Jason? I think Jason's having mic trouble, so that's okay, but okay. Let's see here. One of the things that I mentioned before was, I don't know how much you guys have looked into this, but the centrifugal force at the equator versus the poles. This was a real big one for me in my journey to becoming a flat earther, and this is something that I thought about my whole life. I thought it was a big issue, but we all just sort of rest on the assumption that the Earth is a sphere, it's spinning, everybody's got all this figured out, but I never could understand why there wasn't a major disparity in terms of weight or mass, mass rendered with weight on a scale at the equator versus at the pole. If anyone's ever been on a merry-go-round, if you spin that thing up really fast, or even not so fast, you'll be sort of tugged towards the outside edge. It's just a natural physical law. And if the Earth is spinning that fast at the equator, 1,037.5 miles an hour, and you're perpendicular to the axis, vertically dropping 135 miles an hour, I mean, you're at the edge of a rotor. And that edge is going to have a great deal of centrifugal force exerted on it, yet we don't feel any disparity between there and the pole where there should be none. Have you guys looked into this much? Because to me that was pretty much one of the final nails in the coffin for the globe.
I haven't looked into that, but I always thought it was kind of weird. I've always considered myself to be pretty sensitive to motion and things, and I've traveled the world, and I've never ever been like, oh my gosh, why do I feel weird here? Like why wouldn't I kind of pick up on that or something? It just always seemed a little weird to me now looking back. At the time, I didn't think about it. I didn't think about the motion of Earth, back then. I just took everything for granted.
Right.
I do think about it, now looking back. I'm like, I've never had an experience. I've been in the Arctic Circle, and I've been south of the equator.
Oh,
And
have you?
yes, sir.
So
I've
the
been
northern Arctic Circle? Arctic?
no, sir. I've been south of the equator. I've been in Diego Garcia. It's a small island out in the Indian Ocean.
Ah.
Hey,
Uh,
Jimmy, hear me now?
and I've been to Thule, Greenland. And
Oh, okay.
but never in my travels. And I've been to the Middle East and so on and so forth and so forth. I've been all over, and I've never experienced anything that made me think, boy, this is kind of weird now. Like, I don't know. We're kind of, we're sensitive, aren't we? I kind of consider myself sensitive to these things, and I've never noticed an effect, any sort of physical effect on me having changed locations. You hear this thing called jet lag from just shifting in time zones, but that's not the same thing.
Right. Well, it's like I drove from Florida to Virginia before, and that's not really that big of a latitude switch, but you'd think that we, like, our inner ears, we have the fluid that sort of helps us keep our balance. And you'd think that it would take a while to get adjusted to a different latitude, right? If the Earth was spinning, because, of course, the farther you get away from the equator, allegedly, the slower you're spinning. And so, especially taking a flight that far, you'd expect to experience it a little bit differently. But people, of course, say, oh, well, it's not that big of a difference, and so you wouldn't notice it, and, you can't be so subjective. But really, we should listen to our ears, look through our eyes, and experience with our bodies. And yeah, I've never noticed any difference, but I've never left the continental United States, so I don't think I've gotten far enough out of that frame of reference to really, get the full effect. But yeah, from Greenland to the Middle East, that's a pretty big leap.
Yeah, I've never experienced anything that I would consider like odd on as far as like, oh wow, I feel weird here because because of the change in speed, so yeah, I haven't done much research on it though, but I do find it weird, and I know some other people have done research on it. I don't know if anyone on the panel, but I have seen some other videos, I think, but I'm not 100% sure, but I think Brian Mullen talked about it in one of his videos. He talked about the force itself and kind of like what you were just talking about. So.
Well, and what I found, and yeah, I like Brian Mullen. He does some really good work. What I found is that there is a minor discrepancy in, let's say, a ton of coffee. A ton of coffee at the equator will weigh slightly less at the North Pole. And so it seems to me that the mathematicians have taken this observation and sort of back-engineered the formulas to match that observation, right? And they say it's because of the spin. But it's not. It's because of the barometric pressure. That's all it is. The barometric pressure is higher in the north, and it diminishes as you travel south to the equator and continues to decrease as you go south beyond the equator. And again, that right there is sort of a problem for the globe because you would expect to have that bilateral symmetry, north and south of the equator, but it isn't there. And so what they've done is they've taken that observation, and it's just such a minute little change in weight, and they say, see, the spinning doesn't cause that much centrifugal force. But if you really boil it down, it should. There should be an infinite disparity between the North Pole or the South Pole and the equator, and yet there is no difference. Except for that barometric pressure, your weight is a little bit different at the three locations, but it's not in line with what you would expect if the Earth was spinning. So, the fact that it's flat, water doesn't curve over 10 miles or 20 or 50 or 65. It's a plane. It's not spinning, and it's very difficult for people to look at this objectively and really come to a logical, sound conclusion because of all this pre-programming that we've been subjected to. So I'm amazed, frankly, that so many people are waking up to this. Just because of the pre-programming and, again, the stigma and the negative connotations that are attached to this subject. But what I've found is that people who are researching this and who are quote-unquote flat earthers are really some of the smartest, genuine people that I've ever met. Much more honest, smart, and genuine than the likes of Neil deGrasse Tyson or Stephen Hawking, that's for sure.
I definitely agree, and I'm very happy to see that more people are coming forward and realizing that everything we've been taught just doesn't jive. It just doesn't jive together. And there's too many unexplained things for them to act like all these things are facts, when there's so many things that are still that they can't even explain in their model. So they shouldn't teach these things as fact when they have so many unexplained things for themselves. That drives me crazy.
Yeah, and supporting what you just said, John, is the number of, I think, people that question things are much more critically minded and critical thinkers. So they try and look at every avenue to not only support their own theory or what they think things are, but also to show the contradictions on the conventional wisdom or conventional technology that gets implemented. Going back to the heliocentric model, I can't even consider it anymore during discussions because you're jumping back and forth between two completely different things where it gets difficult to talk. Which one are you talking about? Are we trying to apply what we're discussing to the geo model or the helio model? And it just gets confusing. But
oh yeah. No, I totally understand. And it's like you have to do it sometimes. Like if you're discussing this topic with people who have never been introduced to it, you have to sort of compare apples to apples in each model. And sometimes you'll get tripped up because it's almost like playing tennis. It's like playing a tennis match while you're playing a golf match at the same time, right?
Well, when you're sitting here talking about the centrifugal force and everything at the equator, it's like, well, now I have to go back to the helio model because I'm not on a spinning planet, so I don't know of a difference between the two. And, again, I'm trying to think of what something feels like where the condition isn't even applicable to what I'm trying to think it feels like.
Right. Yeah. No. It is. It's like at what point can we move away from the heliocentric model and just focus on the truth? And I say the only point we get to do that, we have that luxury, is when 51% of the people are flat earthers.
Brian, that's funny. You were saying that that you can't really mix match the two different models with the. I mean, when it comes to the flat Earth, it has to be stationary. When it comes to the sphere Earth, it has to be spinning.
Right.
And so you can't have a sphere Earth that just is sitting there like that documentary the guy did called The Principle, where they're saying that it's still a sphere Earth, but it's the center of the galaxy.
Oh, I never saw it, but so he has it.
Well, I never did either, but I know the basic for it. That's their model.
Yeah, and I'll just go on the record and state, because people do get this confused. The flat, stationary Earth doesn't spin, doesn't move, doesn't orbit anything. I don't think that space, as we believe it exists, even exists. For all we know, the stars could just be light. There may not be any physical attributes to the stars at all. I tend to think that the moon is a physical object, but I'm not so sure about that either. It does go through phases, and some of the other wandering stars go through phases similar to the moon. So it's almost as if you have a mishmash of physical objects in the heavens along with non-physical objects up there. And, we've just wasted so many decades and so much money and so much brain power and time and effort into essentially it's just a paper chase. It's an illusion. And it's like that illusion has been crafted long before our grandparents were born. And part of me thinks that it's sort of a logical conclusion to assume, well, the sun appears to be a sphere and the moon appears to be a sphere, and so do the little dots in the sky, so we must be on a sphere too. I mean, that there is some chain of logic there. But in the ancient Greek days, they didn't have the technology to send up a weather balloon even a single mile, let alone 30 miles, and take pictures of it. Maybe they could have got someone up a mile, but how is it going to get down, right? So we're very lucky to live in an age where we have this technology really, at our fingertips, where we can prove this thing one way or another. And yet, I've looked at weather balloon footage off and on my whole life. And I'll tell you, whoever invented the fisheye lens needs to be shot.
Yeah, and he's a billionaire.
Right.
I saw him on an interview on one of the late night shows, and the guy's such a prick. I mean, an arrogant son of a bitch. And he's just talking how he was in his college dorm and he thought of this idea. Bullshit. They had the technology, and then he was their puppet to say that he was the inventor. I mean, the guy's a Freemason for one thing.
Yeah, I could see me trying to pitch that to like a board of directors at a corporation. It's like, I've got a brilliant idea, guys. Are you tired of looking through human eyes? How would you like to see through the eyes of a fish? They'd kick you out of there. They'd laugh you out of the room, and yet that's what NASA uses. That's what Felix Baumgartner and Red Bull uses to create this illusion of the spherical Earth underneath them. But
it was created by some government entity, and then this guy, whatever his name is, that was supposedly the inventor, is their puppet man to say that he invented it. But really, they needed the fisheye lens to further their whole space and sphere Earth and all this stuff. So they wanted that out there.
Yeah, I think they saw it coming, where they knew that people were going to have technology, very readily available to get up to high altitudes and take, photos, or video recordings. And they set it up so that even if we got to that point, most people are like, oh, I'm going to get a GoPro. That's, I want to see like a fish does when he flies 30 miles in the air, right?
Yeah.
And that's, it really did work, because I remember seeing stuff like that, 2-3 years ago, and like, you can see the curve of the Earth. Isn't that neat? But we don't stop to realize, well, wait a minute. Arizona doesn't take up half of the Earth, does it? Right? Crazy.
Yeah, it's all a deception, but if you're not looking for it, then you're going to be deceived. But now that we have our eyes, opened, so to say, it's so obvious to us as we walk through this life. We see all kinds of deception all around us, and everybody else is walking around like everything's just hunky-dory.
Right, and the deception goes, I believe, everything from the atom, right, to the heliocentric model, and really everything in between. And it's almost like when you wake up to this one, because I've been awake to the moon landings, I've been awake to false flag operations. Those have been going on for, well, all of American history. You've got the Gulf of Tonkin and Pearl Harbor and 9/11. I mean, these are all appear to me to be false flag deceptions. And when it comes down to it, the truth is just so simple and blatant and obvious. But the conditioning and the deception run so deep that it's very difficult for people to snap out of it and just become an objective observer for 10 seconds.
And the other part of it is, if you do even try to look into it, you're labeled as a crazy person.
Well, I think that stigma is starting to slow down. just by the momentum of how many channels are out there and how many view counts there are. And, it's encouraging to some extent when you see how many channels, YouTube channels and sites there are, and then you see that there's tens of thousands of views on, new videos, and you go, well, at least the word's getting out there, and the accuracy.
Yeah, online.
Yeah.
But, I mean, in the real world, I mean, what percentage of the real world people are online looking for this kind of information?
Tiny.
So, you talk to a complete stranger walking around the lake, and they don't know what you're talking about. Why are you even questioning it?
Yeah, you gotta plant that seed though. I've been taking Uber a lot, and I've just been blowing some Uber drivers' mind. They must think I'm totally crazy. But if you plant that seed, 6 months from now, that person might see a flat Earth link on YouTube and say, that one crazy guy was talking about that. Let's click on it. Whereas they may have, I never would have looked into this. Never. When I first heard of it, I was like, oh my God, what is this world coming to? People think the frickin' Earth is flat. Are you serious? This has got to be a psyop. And I didn't touch it for months. And then just one day, it was just because I had a conversation with a friend about it, we were laughing about it, I decided I'm going to look at this and I'm going to make some videos and debunk it. And about a week into that, I was like, oh my God, how frickin' stupid have I been? The Earth isn't spherical, it's not spinning, and there's proof just everywhere.
Yeah.
But our minds are easily conditioned, and we see what we're told is possible as opposed to seeing what we're actually experiencing, right?
Yeah. I have a couple of people that, like, they walk their dogs regularly every day at the same time. And so I can just go down to this local little lake here, and I got my fishing pole in the water, so, I'm pretty approachable. And there's a couple people, one lady in particular, who walks her dog every day at the same time. And, the first time I talked to her, I was with some friends and stuff, and I just was kind of blurting it out, like, did you know that we didn't land on the moon? And, she's probably in her 70s. And she's like, what are you talking about, Sonny? But then I've talked to her like probably about 10 times now, and each time she comes by, she always has a new question, which is good. Because she's not shutting me out completely. She's, interested in it at least. And she's 70 years old, which tells me that she's been through some major indoctrination.
Oh man, and tell me about it. I've been following Bill Schneblin for a while. Bill Schneblin was basically, he claims that he was a 99th degree Mason. He was head of the witches in his area and head of the Satanists and all this. And he was born again, found Christ. Now he's a Christian, and he's been preaching against this whole, satanic Luciferian movement for decades. And just the other day, I watched a video, and good old Bill Schneblin appears to be a globe Earth skeptic, and he's not a spring chicken. He's full white head of hair, full white beard, and so I don't think that age is necessarily a factor here. I mean, it is, because of course the older you are, the longer you've been sort of indoctrinated with this. But yeah, people of all walks are waking up to this, and I see that as very positive, very encouraging. And at some point, the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back is going to happen, and people are going to be really sort of furious with NASA and the like, and wanting them to be gone. We want our $20 billion a year back. I mean, I talked about this last week, but just God, can you imagine what sort of accomplishments we could have done at this point if we would have been spending that sort of effort and money and resources towards actually exploring the world as opposed to faking space? It would be a totally different world, I think.
Is it true that after they crash Juno that there's going to be no alleged spacecraft active? Is that what people understand?
I'm not familiar with that. I know that there's they claim that there's anywhere from like 2,000 to 15,000 satellites.
Okay. No, not satellites, just like Voyager and all those missions with the exception of whatever they say is going on at Mars. Isn't the Juno the thing that's been in the news recently about getting pictures of Jupiter and using
Right.
the old images from about 15 years ago and then adding some sparklers to at the North Pole?
Right, the Northern Lights, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh God, and I forget who it was, but somebody did a video and busted that wide open. They used the exact identical image from like years ago to create that forgery. And yeah, they're tricking people into thinking that we're going out to Jupiter when, we supposedly did that in 1973, I think, with Pioneer 10, and that was a big joke.
And
Uh,
again, it's the battery life on all these alleged spacecraft are pretty amazing to not have any complications and travel for 20 years plus and not have any issues. So the absurdity just gets a little bit
I
above and beyond.
I think what they tried to do, I think what they wanted to do was, after the moon landings and after everybody was like complaining because the astronauts were cutting into the reruns of I Love Lucy, they pulled the
Oh, they were bored
Challenger.
with it. They were bored after I think 12. Yeah, after 12, they did a. I think the first one was in July. Then they had another one in December, and then so it's really the third one, where Apollo 13, where they ran into the issues, and even after 12, the public was losing interest in it. So again, aside from the Gnostic elements between Apollo 13, that they kind of threw that in there too to add some public interest in the whole thing. And kind of
Right.
like with the space shuttle, is after they blew or allegedly blew up the Challenger, that reactivated some interest in the whole program. But
Well, and
I,
see,
I
I think that backfired on him too, because it's funny. I was just talking about this with my wife the other day. It's almost as if the Challenger explosion was like they're stepping away out of space missions, right? Oh, it's too dangerous. We lost a teacher. We lost all. But then you're right. It's almost like it reinvigorated the public interest, and now it appears to me, from what I've seen, is that everybody that was allegedly on the Challenger is alive and well. Most of them
they
didn't
had
even change their names.
or you find out that they had twin siblings.
There was the one guy, right? Yeah, but
They all have twins and triplets, like Paul Washer syndrome. That oh geez, the guy's what, a set of triplets or something, and coincidentally his brothers are stepping in to fill his roles and things. I mean, come on. It, so, but I remember with the Challenger, the reason I hated it was that the Bears had just won the Super Bowl that weekend, and the Challenger was on Tuesday, and that kind of blew out the air from the party balloons for the Bears Super Bowl. But
well,
I,
well, you can go back to your victory dance because they're fine. Nobody was hurt in the
Right.
Challenger hoax.
I want to say, as a father of twins, you can't, if one twin is an astronaut and the other twin is whatever, you can't just say, okay, well, hey, brother, why don't you step into this astronaut role just because you look like your brother? You have to be an astronaut. You can't just look like one.
Well, and to be an astronaut, you have to be a lion sack up.
Well, yeah, but you get what I'm saying is you can't just be a look-alike and step into that role and be expected to perform the same as your brother who was an astronaut.
Right. Well, and what the whole thing is though is like, okay, all what was it? 6 people supposedly died on the Challenger, and 5 of them are, they're doppelgangers with the same name, except for like a couple of them just kind of modified their names a little bit. But yeah, it appears that they're alive and well. The female teacher is still a teacher, I believe, at a university. She looks exactly the same, and there's some pretty good documentaries. I'm really surprised that people actually found that so easily. But it's like they didn't have to go that deep in the deception because everybody just gobbles up what NASA asserts and never questions it. Even
And there was no internet.
Right. Even the skeptical scientists just, they listen to NASA and they take that as gospel, and we really need to be more objective scientists of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Going back real quick to a couple items, following up on your introduction speech, that a couple weeks ago I started to look into, everyone's kind of focused, or a lot of people are focused in on how we see, with the Polaris and the same rotation with the stars. And it seemed to me with memory that at one point there was some event that allegedly knocked the Earth off its axis, or there's supposed to be a shift in the theoretical axis. And is it wrong to say that if there's a shift in the axis, that would throw out the whole alignment with stars and the constellation rotation and prediction of celestial events?
Yeah, you'd think it would all shift.
I think one of them was the earthquake in Japan was supposed to throw the Earth off its tilt.
Yeah, and how does that work, right? Like, that is just such bull. An earthquake throwing off the Earth's rotational axis. Yeah.
John, you've got Wiki right there. Look up shift in axis. I think Wiki's got a page on it.
Now, John, that's very disrespectful to the Japanese. They got shook really hard. Don't take their stories of shifting Earth away from them.
Right, but it's all I know. But it's almost like, okay, Robert, lift yourself up by your shoes and carry yourself to the ceiling, right? I mean, if something happens in this local spinning Earth system, I just don't see how that's going to affect the spinning. But I mean, of course, we all know it's not spinning and it's stationary, but just the garbage that they put in the news as fact. But yeah, you're right, Brian. Like, if that did occur, wouldn't we expect to see some sort of change in the alignment with Polaris, and it's 26 million times further than the sun?
Right, and then again, with what I'm concentrating on are the eclipse events and how they have them predicted, or the events modeled from 3000 BC to 3000 AD. And if they're just Google Earth shift, and on regular news or events, and it gives you a line of things where all these media sources are saying, yeah, people think that the Earth is shifted off its axis, and it's like, okay, if that is occurring, then it's going to throw off all these other things.
Right. Yeah. So I pulled up the first result I found is epic global changes and axis shifts. The first one is the Earth's axis underwent a significant shift in December of 2004.
Really?
Yeah, that's what they claim.
I didn't feel
it was the shifting of the Earth's axis which caused the Indonesian tsunami, which killed 250,000 people in 2004. Wouldn't you know? The axis shift is one of many subjects classified TS by the world government, and I'm not sure what TS means.
That means top secret,
Top
sir.
secret, right.
Ah, top secret as in total...
Don't tell
shit.
anyone the Earth shifted.
Total shitstorm.
Yeah.
Since 2004, the sun has been rising and setting north of the U.S. in June. Which that doesn't make any sense. I mean, so the axis shifts, then the relative position of the sun changes, but the North Pole star Polaris stays in alignment with the axis. I mean, come on, really? Where's the astronomers at on this? Seriously.
Seriously. Come on.
I'm so serial.
Yeah, the North Star hasn't moved at all on that, huh?
Really?
That makes no sense.
It's because it's really far away.
Yeah, really far away. So far away. No, not buying it.
That's their answer to it, though.
Well, and see, that's the
really
thing, though. Even a half a degree change in where our axis is pointing would equate to millions of light years when you're talking about a distance that far. It's 433.8 light years. Okay, not millions of light years, millions of miles. But yeah, no, the North Pole Star Polaris just remains fixed above the axis no matter what, and so something's going on with the sun, right? And that I've heard some different sort of things in the news and whatnot of what's going on with the sun. Has anyone looked into that? Because I think that's probably more along the lines of what's going on, is that there's something, some shift in what the sun's doing. There's no sort of shift in our planet because it doesn't move anyway.
Well, I think we're going to have to wait for all that data that we collected on the tracking the sun. We can probably get more information. I don't know if anybody's actually digging through all that data, but...
Well, I don't want to get into the Mandela stuff, but it certainly seems like these things pop up out of nowhere, and it's really testing people's ability on how good their recollection is versus, hey, let's just throw a little mud in the water to, and say, hey, things have changed. Well, we really know what they were before. So, again,
Right.
I'm not trying to Mandela affect the conversation here, but you're saying that your memory is better than everything else, and that's pretty arrogant starting point to say, hey, let me look into the sun changing because someone said the sun's changing. Well, okay,
Yeah.
care of you for about 2 days while you're on that little chase.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I want to say about that is, as far as being arrogant and having saying that my memory is better than reality, the only problem I have, and which really has caused me to still think that something weird is going on, Mandela effect wise, is the fact that the people that are remembering it differently are all remembering it the same wrong answer. And how would that? I mean, wouldn't we have our own opinion of how it used to be?
Oh, I agree. I didn't mean that to really sound like it did, but I think, if there's 100 items now that are being determined as Mandela effects, there's a good chunk, especially the ones where they say the Bible's changed or the scripture has different line items than it did before. That's where it gets into kind of, I think they're throwing things into the pot that just aren't there. So
Yeah, I looked into that Isaiah 11:6 verse, and where it talks about the lion laying down with the lamb, and now it says wolf. Now I can't really be sure. I've read the Bible many times, but I just can't be sure about that passage
but
whether I remember
it
it.
all depends on the version and stuff. So,
Yeah, well, I've looked into a lot of different versions, and to me it looks like it's been changed, but I can't really say for sure because I don't remember exactly reading that. I just remember hearing, at Sunday school or something and on up, the lion lays down with the lamb. But
Well, we all remember the one with the wolf in sheep's clothing. But yeah, I've heard so many different things that they've said have changed. But even the namesake, the whole Mandela thing. I remember I was young, but I remember when he was in prison, and there was all those people that wanted him out, and then finally he got released. But then you have apparently this whole cross section of the population who thought he had died. And I just talked to somebody today that says, yeah, I remember when he died. And it's like, well, wait a minute, like really, like what's going on here? I think it's just people. I think that people tend to remember what they heard and what. Let me put it this way: you can have 5 witnesses to the same event, and each of those 5 witnesses can have completely different versions of what happened. Now, if each one of those 5 witnesses tells 10 people, and each one of those 10 people tells 10 people, then you're going to have 500 different versions of what happened because people tend to, remember what they want to remember and embellish what they want to embellish.
That's why it's so strange because everybody's got the same wrong story.
Right.
So
Woo.
That's a hell of a ringtone there.
That is. Reading down here, I was just sort of skimming through this while we were talking, but it says, okay, the axis shift is one of many subjects classified top secret or total shit by the world governments. Since 2004, the sun has been rising and setting north of the U.S. in June. The sun should never be farther north than the Tropic of Cancer on June 21st, the summer solstice. The Tropic of Cancer is located in mid-Mexico, Egypt, India, Myanmar, and China. The inverse is true for the southern hemisphere, which should never be farther south than the Tropic of Capricorn on December 21st, or the shortest day, located in mid-Paraguay, Australia, and Botswana. The fact that the sun is south of Africa and Australia in December proves this is an axis shift, not a crust shift. Now, that right there is just so stupid. Because if we were looking for an axis shift, the best indicator would be the North Star Polaris, which is just right where it's always been.
Yep.
Right? So, who we on that?
Yeah, we pretty much debunked that one.
Awesome. All right. So, who have we not talked to? We lost Jason. We've got Brian. We've got Fran. So we've been about an hour and a half. Does anybody have anything that they want to add? Topics? I know, Brian, I don't know if you feel up to it, but I know that you had been researching the relative distance to the moon and how that changes. Do you want to try to get into that today, or is that a little bit much?
Yeah, I just need a little running jump into that. So yeah, now it's probably not good. Sorry about the phone call.
No problem. And just for those of you guys out there who don't know, Brian started the Facebook group, the $5,000 NASA Eclipse Challenge. And what's the skinny on that? Have you had any takers? Are you converting many globe Earth proponents with that page, or how's it going?
Well, again, it gets back to Robo Shark. I don't know your first name.
Robert.
Robert. Yeah, Robert was saying how people have to plant the seed and let it take off, and that's all the NASA Eclipse Challenge really was to get the seed out there. And again, for those who don't know, it sent the information saying that the NASA Eclipse data fits a flat Earth model and not a globe model. And that information was sent out to about 1,000 university physics departments across the nation. And concurrent with that, about 850 or so TV news stations were given the information that this challenge to oppose this theory that all eclipse data can only fit on a flat Earth model, that the news departments were apprised of what was going on. And the momentum from that kind of dropped off fairly quick because it really needed a lot of people to pursue it and call up the universities and ask them about it and the validity. Is it something that can be done, or is it just all nonsense? And so it kind of, it came and it went. And the only thing I've done since then with the whole challenge is sent the same information to about 1,500 Christian schools across the nation to kind of let them know that this challenge is going on, and university physics departments haven't been able to contradict the theory and stuff. So, yeah.
Well, and it's not even about theory, really, because I got pretty in-depth in that with you, and it's just basic geometry and
Right.
measurable facts that it just simply these eclipse data, especially their specific eclipses that the totality traverses essentially way in the south and way in the north, like in the 90-degree latitudes, which is physically impossible given the supposed alignments of the sun to moon to earth in the heliocentric model. The way that I sort of summarized it is that eclipses, or the totality of eclipses, should only be really sort of a tropical event, right? Because you've got the sun orbiting, allegedly orbiting the Earth on the ecliptic, and the moon allegedly orbiting the sun essentially on that same plane, plus or minus 2.5 degrees, there's no possible way that the shadow cast by the moon could hit the frickin' 90-degree south latitude or come even close. It shouldn't go beyond the tropics. But there's just how many eclipses were there over 100 years that went way outside of those boundaries? There were several of them.
Probably about 20%.
Yep.
And right now, I'm looking at all the. I got a pretty good handle on the distance of the sun away from the flat Earth surface, being about 3,925 miles. And now just trying to figure out how the moon acts, if it really changes in elevation and acts like a lens sliding in and out, or if there actually is a change in elevation. And to support, if it does change in elevation, is how the light may change from the South Pole to the center of the flat model. And right now, to me, pretty conclusive that the sun does not change in elevation, and to really reconstruct the eclipse events is to recreate where the moon is passing over the sun for the solar eclipses.
Right.
I know it's hard to describe things that really takes a visual concept. I can do a quick screen share if you want.
Sure.
So we can show that the traditional explanation for eclipses is not right, but the thing that I run into when I try to talk to skeptics about it is they always say, okay, well, they ignore the point that I made that proved that it doesn't work the way that they say, but they focus on the fact that I don't really know how it actually works.
Well, I would say that especially a solar eclipse in the heliocentric model, to me, would just be so unlikely, such a very random, once in a blue moon thing, and yet it goes in perfect 18-year cycles. And it's this perfect cyclical nature of the heavenly bodies that really, really does lend itself to a flat Earth model, and really just flies in the face of a globe Earth model. And one of the observations that Brian came away with that I thought was really, really on point was the distance to the sun appears to be about 3,900 miles. And that's what they used for the radius of the spherical Earth, was about 3,900 miles, and so it's almost as if they inverted it. And I'm not going so far as to say that we live on the inside of a ball. What we're saying is that the geometry and the numbers work because it's just the inverse of the similar situation, right?
Yeah, it's just flattening out the what they're calling is a sphere from North Pole to South Pole, is they're flattening that out, and it's the actual bending of the sunlight that creates the where you can be on the South Pole and see the sun at an angle of 10 degrees, 15 degrees, and again it's the bending of light up to where you're directly underneath the light, and at 90 degrees, sun being overhead, that it's directly giving you the sun distance. Again, mathematically, it works out where it's just the complete inverse of the given radius of Earth. I don't know if I'm screen sharing or not.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. Hold on a second.
I'm not sure if they're getting it live. I'll check. Oh, and of course my internet's acting funky, but that's okay. Yeah, one of the other things too that I think is so important is visible space from winter to summer, and I did touch on this in the opening, but this one here is just open and shut case. It's not the heliocentric model's wrong, and my point is, in order for the heliocentric model to work, all of these little intermechanisms must be exactly as they say. Everything they say that they've got it figured out to a T, and if one little bit of this is proven to be fallacious, then the rest of it falls apart. And there's just so many of them, but according to the heliocentric model, they've got us again orbiting the sun at a 60-degree angle to the sun's path around the galactic plane, and that means that say in the summer we'd be north, visible space would be north and west of the galactic plane. That means we should be looking way off into the cosmos, up above and to the left of the galactic plane, and that's the only stars we could see for that season. Mm-hmm. Fast forward 6 months, the Earth is southeast of the galactic plane, and visible space would be the whole nother sector of the universe. And yet we can see all of the same stars from season to season. The North Pole star Polaris never changes. People claim that it has once, but that's irrelevant. The fact is that the North Pole star being fixed above the magnetic north, or the so-called axis of rotation, is conclusive proof that the whole entire thing's wrong. Visible space doesn't change at all. It comes back right to where it was, maybe a hair off. They call it the precession of the equinoxes, but that's never been observed. That's a 26,000-year cycle. How many astronomers have been studying the stars for 26,000 years? None. Astronomy goes back maybe 5,000 years at the most, and we're talking Sanskrit at that point, right?
Yeah, plus if you're like me, I don't even believe the Earth is 26,000 years old.
Yeah, I mean, geologists claim that they've got a way to date rocks, right?
Yeah, if you could date rocks, then all the rocks should be the same date.
Right, exactly.
Well, there are three major assumptions when they get into the carbon date testing. They make three major assumptions that are pretty ludicrous when you look into it. So, they've done the carbon-14 testing on the same bone and gotten thousands of years difference between the same bone. So, it assumes a start point, it assumes a lineal aging process or decay rate, and I forgot what the third one was, but
I think it's like the chemical composition of the atmosphere remaining exactly the same for all of history, right?
Yeah, and again, it just makes some really wild assumptions from the get-go that again can give you results no matter or whatever you want. So if you want to make it a million years or 500 million years, just tell me what you want. It always gets interesting where they base fossils on the depth in the soil, and they measure the depth in the soil by the fossils. So you got
it's a circular argument.
Circular support of your findings where there's no foundation to it.
And I like the picture that Kent Hovind uses on his stuff. I don't agree with Kent Hovind on a lot of his stuff, and I think that he's actually paid agent now. Maybe they got to him in prison. Maybe he never went to prison. But he always shows this picture of this rock strata where you see the layers, but then there's a tree growing up right through the middle of all of them.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, just with that one picture, it blows that whole. You can measure the age of something by how deep it is, kind of thing.
Right. Well, they go with the deeper in the soil is the older the item, and you can apply the same logic to in a massive flood. You've got the smallest particles and the sediment at the bottom, and then larger items on top.
Yeah, just like when you go gold panning and you put a whole bunch of dirt in a gold pan and you shake it.
Right.
You got to have water in there, and it's a perfect explanation for a flood.
Right.
Plus, as far as fossils go, you can't have a fossil unless the animal is completely encased in an airtight vacuum of mud. Otherwise, it would just decompose.
Right.
I agree with you with that. People who defend the globe Earth at this point, anyone who's been doing it as pronounced as they have, they've got to have a dog in the fight at this point.
Well, I'm reluctant. I'm reluctant to say, and like take Kent Hovind for an example. And as a matter of fact, one of his, I guess, interns or whatever, did a couple shows with us, and showed some interest in it, and then I never heard from him again. Um, but I'm still reluctant to say, oh well, so and so or Kent Hovind or whoever is an agent because they're not on board with flat Earth, because we got to remember. Well, at least I do. I remember how silly I thought it was, and I shut it out for months after being introduced to it for the first time. And some people, Kent Hovind has done great work in terms of debunking evolution. My jaw hit the floor when I first heard some of his talks because he was right on point. And you'd think that somebody like him, who proclaims to be an evangelical Christian, which means they believe the Bible is literal word for word, that it is kind of disheartening, because the very beginning of the Bible clearly states, in Genesis, that the earth is fixed and immovable, which is sort of the topic of this show, because you got to remember, if it's fixed and immovable, which I don't like to use biblical arguments, but I am talking about evangelical Christians here, then the heliocentric principles, the model, everything falls apart. And to me, it was a huge affirmation that the Bible there was something to it. I grew up in a household where I knew the Bible and science from when I was very young, and science won the day. I thought the Bible was stupid. I thought it was lies because they got it wrong from the very beginning. What are they talking about? Stupid people running around in the sand thinking that the earth is fixed and immovable. That's how I felt about it for most of my life. And when you do realize that the Bible had that correct, we really have to stop and think about, well, all the arguments. It's like, the Bible can't be the Word of God, or the Bible can't be true. It's just, fallible men writing down what their belief system was, which is partially true. The spherical Earth wasn't introduced for 1,500 years, and so if you're using your senses and common sense, the Earth doesn't move. It's the stars and the heavenly bodies that move, and so I don't think that the Bible was necessarily written to prove or disprove the flat or spherical Earth. It just is what it is.
And it happens to be right.
Technically, it was correct. Exactly. Yeah. So
I
what do you
like to use the creation along with flat Earth, as a big point in that creation argument, to lead people to first not naming God or using the Bible at all. I just try to lead them to the idea that there must be a creator. And I don't think you really even need flat Earth to do that, because there's obviously a creation, and it's complex, and it's been designed by an intelligent designer. You can't just explode stuff and you get trees and plants and animals and all that. So I just use that as a way to steer them towards that. And when you throw the flat Earth in there as another bullet of ammunition for the creation, and you use the Bible, you can say, look, the Bible had it right. This is what it is. And then once they get past the idea that there's a creator, and now they see that the Bible was right, they start looking into it. And I've had a lot of people that are already Christians that are stiff-necked, stubborn bastards. Then you talk to somebody who might be an atheist or just doesn't claim any kind of religion or God, and you tell them, and they have a lot more of an open mind about it.
Yeah, that's really odd, and it's true. But it's funny because we were talking about this the other day. We watched that movie, and I've actually plugged this movie a couple times, but The Gods of Egypt, and we were watching some documentaries about ancient Rome and that sort of thing, and we were sort of laughing at them about how, these ancient people actually believed in these, multi-theistic gods in the sky and demigods and, this kind of thing and that, but juxtapose that with today's society. People really believe this preposterous lie, this preposterous worldview that they live stuck to the side of a spinning sphere flying through outer space. And so how much smarter are we really than the ancients? And I say we're way stupider, and that's not even a word.
And the ancients believed in all those multiple gods because I honestly believe that there were beings that were godlike, and that's the word they used to describe them because they weren't human and they were probably a lot taller. They probably had some kind of spiritual knowledge that they had technology they could show that looked like miracles, or maybe it was supernatural. But I believe that they were describing something that was in their reality, and
Well, that's right. And so, okay, so if the Bible is technically correct about the shape and nature of the world, the Bible talks about, the Nephilim, which were the sons of women and the sons of fallen angels, more or less. And they were, they call them, the Bible says they were the giants, the men, the renowned men of old. Think Hercules and that sort of thing, or Spartacus, or
the Clash of the Titans.
The original. What was the no, the Tower of Babel was built by Nebuchadnezzar or Nimrod. It makes a lot of sense that
I hold to that. I didn't want to say use the Bible in that argument, but I do hold to that. I believe that they were the product of angels and human women that created these so-called abominations or Nephilim giants.
Well,
and those are the things and plus there was a lot of genetic mixing going on, so there probably were half goat, half man type gods, or men with bird heads. So they put that hieroglyphic up there because there was a guy walking around with a bird head.
Again, that gets back into the corruption of mankind, playing around with the DNA structure and everything else.
Yeah, and that's happening now today. And so in the Bible it says, as in the days of Noah, which in those days there was a lot of genetic mixing going on. Right. And now we're starting to do that again. So that's a sign of bad things to come, I think.
Yeah, and the first
genetics.
Yeah, the first generation of the fallen angels, the children were the Titans, and I think there was the second generation were the Olympians. So that's where you get to the people, or the Zeuses and Hercules. I think Hercules was an Olympian, but the Titans of Zeus were huge. For lack of.
And those myths are based on something that those people actually saw. They didn't just make it up.
Yeah, you talk to anyone from Greece, that isn't it isn't mythology. It's their history.
Yeah.
And
it does get kind of scary, because you're right. I mean, even now, I mean, there are supposedly federal laws against hybrid humans or genetically engineering humans and animals, but from what I gather, there are places in this world where there aren't such laws, and probably we've got some unacknowledged black budget programs here in the United States where they're doing similar things. But just reading a quick little article, hybrid animals are created when gametes, or reproductive cells, is GAMETES, from different species join to form a single embryo. A mule, for example, is the offspring of a female horse and a male donkey. Every cell in the body of hybrids contains genetic material from both parents. But when you, and this is just me, but when you look at things like genetically modified vegetables, even like corn, there's everything from like spider DNA to just all kinds of really bizarre things. Then you've got chimeras, named after creatures from Greek mythology, which are created artificially by combining genetic material from different species into a single embryo. The adult animals that develop have different populations of cells that reflect different contributions from the species from which they are produced. Scientists have created the geep, for example, by combining genetic material from both a goat and a sheep. So they're doing this thing, and it is sort of, I mean, I would say it's scary, but to me it's almost, I'm optimistic about it, because it's just yet another affirmation that the prophecy contained in the Bible is coming to pass, and there's no way they could have known this 2,000 years ago. Right?
I agree.
Yeah, so I guess we're almost at the 2 hour mark, so I'm going to start wrapping this up. Let me get back to the hangout here, but looks like the only two that hang on. I do apologize to the other panel members, Fran and Jason. I guess they dropped off. I know people have been having computer problems on my hangouts, so if
Well,
it's my
Fran
fault.
said she had to go to a birthday party.
Oh
She missed
yeah.
out.
Well, it's always a real treat to have Fran, and y'all can find her stuff on Fran Anderson on YouTube. She's got some really good sort of introductory flat Earth videos, and she's a really, really smart chick, and she does a great presentation. So if you're not subscribed or if you haven't checked out Fran Anderson's work on YouTube, check that out. For me, you can find my stuff on The Morgile, The Morgile 2, and Jonathan Christopoulos. And of course, this show and these channels are all viewer and listener supported. You can support us through fan funding on YouTube or through PayPal to John E. Lance at Gmail. That's JONELANCE at Gmail through PayPal. And real quick before we go, I'll give Brian, if you have any closing thoughts, anything that you want to plug, feel free. We've got a few minutes.
Well, at the beginning, you're also talking about how Tesla technology, that we would be a better society if we all used it. And it's kind of hard for me to believe that those in the know have not used Tesla technology to some extent. And the only way I can kind of add foundation to that thought is you look at the HARP facility in Alaska, and if you find any transmission lines to feed power to that, I'd be surprised. So somehow they're creating three megawatt generator to fuel the HARP program. I don't know if it's still active or not, and they're getting that power from somewhere.
Right.
And it's little things like that where I think that those in the know are utilizing Tesla technology to their own benefit, and it is not public domain. And
Oh, yeah.
with the way the towers are brought down, that you have a direct energy device, and with a Hurricane Aaron offshore, a couple hundred miles, that it's hard for me to believe that somehow they didn't harness the energy off of that to bring down the towers. Now, to put pen to pencil on how that actually was, I'm not going to get into that. But it's certainly hard to dismiss that that was not somehow using the, going back to the electromagnetic radiation generated from natural sources. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, and one of the things that I really think Tesla was spot on with is that he saw the world itself as essentially unlimited capacity or unlimited potential energy, and just to simply pull energy out of the ether. And yeah, it really does make you wonder, where are they generating all that electricity for HARP up in, what is it, Alaska?
yeah, you can go to Google Earth and go to the HARP facility, and you would think to generate that whole facility to kick out three megawatts, or I can't remember if that's the actual output, but
It's a buttload of watts.
it's the futon of watts. Again, just the power source for that is not something that you use with a long extension cord in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it seems to me that they're just pulling energy right out of the ether.
Yeah, and
there's-
if all that technology was available to everybody, I think our society would have been a lot more advanced. We wouldn't be driving, using any equipment that burns, fossil fuels. It would just be a much better society. We might
Yeah,
even be flying around on little bike things like in the Iron Republic.
right.
I mean, in layman's terms, the energy is there. It's just tapping into it everywhere. And in real simplistic terms, that the Tesla technology, that the world acts like a big speaker, with the perimeter being the negative charge and the center being the positive. It's just tapping into that whole field. The Earth the grounded Earth being a positive charge and the atmosphere being a negative charge. So you play with that field with just really raw positive negative charges that gets into how the fields generally act. Then you've got the conductivity of the salt water, and over land you have the mineral polarity going on. So all those interact with each other. And going back to the pyramids, where the Giza pyramid or the Great Pyramid is, I guess, theoretical or even known to be in the center of the landmass of the Earth.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I remember actually arguing about that with people on some forums years ago, because I had researched it, and lots and lots of archaeologists and geologists agreed that Giza was at the geographical center of all land masses on the Earth, and
pre-flood.
Well, and people were arguing, well, the Earth's a sphere. How can there be a geographic center? Show me the center of a tennis ball, right? Or show me the center of the face of a tennis ball. And, my argument was, well, show me the land masses on the tennis ball, and then you can figure out where the geographical center is. But since it isn't a ball, yeah, I think that that there is something to that, to Giza being smack dead in the middle of all of the land masses. And, now it's in the middle of a desert a few miles from the Nile. But when it was in its heyday, there's good evidence to suggest that the desert area out there was plush green forests with, plenty of water and fountains, and it must have been very beautiful. And it's almost as if they used the pyramids to harness that power. And there's some really good research that's gone into it recently. It appears that the Great Pyramids were essentially capturing this piezoelectric effect, which is caused by water sort of ebbing and flowing underneath it, and the certain types of, I guess, limestone underneath the pyramids would generate a charge. And within the pyramids, they were able to harness that, capture it, and do who knows what. I don't think they were contacting aliens in the Crab Nebula, but they very well may have just been using it for things like hydraulic and mechanical power.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more practical than taking the leap and saying there were, aliens and space travel and all this stuff. It's like maybe they were just tapping into that power. That was like their main power plant for the city, and that's
well,
why
they certainly watch the stars too. But I just think that it's sort of a leap for archaeologists and Egyptologists to say, okay, they watched the stars and they had this technology, therefore they were contacting aliens in the Crab Nebula, right?
Yeah, that's a big
It's
jump.
just ridiculous. And people also claim that the Egyptians had a different North Star than we do, and that their constellations would have been slightly different, or whatever they claim. But the fact is it hasn't changed. Those alignments are still very, very much well aligned, even thousands of years. We don't even know how old the pyramids are. When were they built? There's people that claim that they're hoaxes and that they were built recently. I haven't seen any evidence, real evidence for that. But there's some people out there who think that even that's a hoax. I don't know.
I don't know about that.
Anything to obfuscate the whole issue is, it's going to happen. So when in doubt, create aliens and use that for an excuse. When in doubt, say some Gnostic information was disseminated through space travel and everything else. So,
Well, the thing is too, in the flat Earth, I think that visitors from other worlds are theoretically possible now. Whereas in a heliocentric model, there's no way that any being or any race of beings could travel from one star system to another, let alone one galaxy to another. But if they're just skipping across their southernmost region, then that becomes, well, doable and theoretically possible.
Wait, what did you just say?
Well, there's a lot of people who believe that they've been abducted by, aliens, and I would just submit that they're not coming from another planet. They may be coming from a world that's adjacent to ours. The only way that we're ever going to figure this out for sure is if we spend a buttload of money exploring our world and what's beyond the southernmost region, instead of wasting our time and money, firing rockets off into the Atlantic.
Yeah, I have to say that what you just said about the aliens coming from just a different part of our Earth, that's definitely a possibility. There's no way we can say either way until we are able to explore. But I believe that the technology that we have now limits the distance that we can go into that environment. Like we can't
Well,
really explore the ocean very well. I mean, we've got maybe 10% of it explored, and when it comes to that kind of environment and sub-zero temperatures and winds and that kind of stuff, once you start getting farther and farther away from your supply line, there's a finite distance that you can go as a human being with the technologies that we have now.
well, I would urge everyone out there listening right now, and probably everyone listening has seen it, but I did, well, I read the sort of, it was a series of articles called The Iron Republic. You mentioned a minute ago, Robert, but basically there was this guy named Barrington in the late 1800s. He was essentially sick of the England or the European life, and decided, when his family died, he was going to take his fortune. I think he had 50,000 gold coins or something, like 50,000 pounds in gold coins or something. Bought him a very nice ship and went. He was going to go to the North Pole, but then at the last minute decided to go to the South Pole, and found a way through the ice barrier, if you will, found a way through the permafrost. It was a permanent channel, that's what he said, and kept going south, south, south until it started warming up, found another continent, and it was inhabited by people who had sort of splintered off of the migration of pilgrims over to the Americas, and they had been there for a couple hundred years. They had things like wireless communication, they had just literally flying machines before airplanes were invented, and just all these different things that this guy couldn't have imagined in the late 1800s, and yet we're seeing these technologies crop up here in the last 20 years or so. And so it's, to me, I was very skeptical about it, and we were just talking about this earlier, I ran into a couple of phrases that Barrington used in that article. And again, I do have it on my YouTube channel in its entirety. It's called The Iron Republic. It's very, very interesting if you're into audiobooks and into
Yeah, I
supposedly
listened to it
factual
twice,
accounts.
and it's
Yeah.
5.5 hours long, and I had to listen to it twice. I was like, did a double
Oh,
take.
it's
What was that?
yeah.
Just listen.
It's an amazing story. But a couple of the things that he said, and the two that stuck out in my mind, is he mentioned parachutes and telephones, and I had to go back and do a double take. So I'm like, wait a minute. How would he know about parachutes and telephones? Were those words even around? And I researched it, and yeah, the idea and the concept and the technology of parachutes was around since I think the 1750s or something like that, way long enough. And the telephone had been around for a couple decades when he wrote this, and so I don't necessarily say that proves that it's true, but it erased a lot of the doubt in my mind. And so if that's true, if this one guy in a ship just so happened to find his way through, and other people did, hundreds of years before that, when the Americas were being colonized, to me, it makes a lot of sense why the superpowers of the world would want to keep us away from the Antarctic and
Hmm.
sort of keep it out of the public conscience so well as they've done. And if we could literally take some ships south and find this cross and find this opening, who wouldn't want to go exploring other worlds? I mean, everybody would, and the powers that ought not be would lose quite a foothold, I think. And so, to me, that provides them with ample motive to pull off this deception. And after Admiral Byrd went to the South Pole or whatever, they found all sorts of resources, coal, fuel, diamonds, probably all sorts of stuff, and they just backed out, and nobody ever goes down there except for what's that one Norwegian guy's name? um, can't think of it, but he was actually arrested for trying to go down there. Now, of
Hmm.
course, we'll send our militaries down there. We just had Robert. He went down there with the Royal Navy. He wasn't in the Navy, but they basically keep them cordoned off to a small area. They're not allowed to do much exploring. And what are we wasting our money on down there?
Yeah. Yep. So when you say, I just want to clarify because when you say other worlds, I think it would probably be better to say other civilizations because it's the same Earth. It's just
Well, I think of, yeah, and you're right. I think of our world as simply an imaginary barrier or an imaginary line, which is the southernmost path of the sun in the the southern summer. So when the sun is sort of traversing along the Tropic of Capricorn, it doesn't heat up too far south of there. When you get really, really far south of that, it gets so cold and inhospitable, and really nothing lives down there, that it's the perfect natural barrier, and you could call that sort of the edge of our world. Now, if you go south through the Antarctic and there's another solar system, so to speak, which is what Barrington said there was. He said it had its own sun, and I don't remember him talking about the moon or stars. That's one thing that I don't remember him saying in that. But it appears as if there's other ecosystems or other solar systems, not in the sense that we think of the solar system, but just the sun going around and heating up the area.
yeah. I don't remember it saying in the Iron Republic that he mentioned another sun, but I maybe he did. I don't know.
He didn't mention it, but it was sort of obvious because there was sunrise and sunset, but he had traveled, well beyond the 90 degrees south, and then his compass started acting funky, and you definitely have to, I wouldn't say read it. I know people don't like to read much, so I did the legwork. I read it, recorded it, even went page through page and added some sound effects and music. So it's actually sort of a nice listen, and anyone out there who hasn't listened or seen it, I would definitely recommend it. And another one, which I didn't do, but Flatwater Flat Earth did, was a similar expedition. It was a Norwegian father and son team who went to the land beyond the 90 degrees north. And so it appears to me, just based on these testimonies, and I really don't think these guys had any reason to lie, although they could have been fabricating it, but it appears as if there are other worlds. And, people say, oh, that's anti-Christian, that's anti-biblical, blah, blah, blah. But even Christ said to Pilate, my Father's kingdom is not of this world. And I don't think that we should cap God off to only being able to create one world. God has unlimited, infinite power. He can do whatever he wants. And so with that being said, I think that it's quite possible and not anti-Christian at all to assume there may be other worlds adjacent to ours on this same plane.
Yeah, and I totally think that that's very likely.
Awesome. Well, listen, I want to thank everyone out there for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. I want to give a special thanks to all of our supporters, all of our panel members, and all of our live listeners. You guys are the best. Definitely be on the lookout for some new videos. I've got a couple projects in the works. It's just been sort of slow going, but hopefully I can keep everybody sort of appeased with the live shows and just keep y'all updated on what I'm doing and where my research is taking me. I do want to eventually organize some sort of a Flat Earth family union. I've actually started a GoFundMe for it, but I haven't launched it. I haven't advertised it, but I think it's really overdue. I think it's high time that we come together physically. And I think that we'll be, not to sound fascist, but we'll be stronger if we're together as opposed to sort of sticks hanging out in the wind. And that's sort of what we've got now. Everybody that doesn't adhere to my version of Flat Earth is a shill and an agent and that sort of thing. As long as we can agree on common ground that the Earth is flat and stationary, then you're all right in my book. If you believe the Earth is a spinning sphere, then prove it to me. That's my thing. Where's the proof? Where's the curvature? Where's the spinning? Where's the orbital motion? Where's the 1 to 2 million miles an hour of the galaxy? And the simple fact is you can't show any of that. You can't prove it. And so it's really time for people to start looking at flat Earth, and maybe we'll have some better answers for some of these mysteries that still linger. But other than that, I really hope that y'all have a blessed remainder of your weekend. And don't forget to spread the word, spread the world, and peace.
Bye.
Okay, and we are live. Hello, everybody out there across the plane. It's a beautiful day here on the East Coast. Hope you guys are all having a great day. We're going to do Season 2, Episode 4 of Static Plain Truth Live. With me today so far, I've got my good close friend Brian Stage. Brian, how you doing, bud? I think Brian's muted, so that's cool. Oh, and we just got Robert to join. Hey, Robert, how's it going, bud?
Hey man, how's it going? Did you guys go live yet?
Yep, we're live. We've got a few viewers piling in, so just for the next couple minutes, we'll let everybody sort of pile in. And I got a... Huh?
No, I unmuted myself, and the rust, shake the rust off of doing all this, and thanks for inviting me back.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's good to have you back, man, and we've got some really interesting topics to talk about today. I'm going to start off just with sort of a little monologue while everybody piles in. We should have some more panel members and, of course, some more live viewers, but let me go up to the top here. And, you know, the internet, and especially YouTube, has been taken by storm regarding this whole flat Earth matter, especially over the last year or two. Unfortunately, the simple phrase flat Earth carries with it a lot of stigma or negative connotations that will sort of make your average person, you know, step back a few paces from you and look at you like you're crazy. We've collectively been conditioned to scoff at the idea as ridiculous and anti-scientific and all that. While there is indeed a great deal of physical evidence and experimentation to support and even, yes, prove the fact that standing water, for example, possesses exactly 0.0 degrees of curvature over dozens of miles, 50 miles, and even over 100 miles, if you're talking about radio tower shots, which would be physically impossible if the Earth was a sphere. I've stated this before, but the simple lack of curvature over such distances, especially with standing water, is sufficient to debunk the notion that we live on a ball. This is really important, but we could just as easily call this stationary Earth revelation independently of the flat Earth revelation. So, in other words, the fact that this puppy is stationary is just as good a proof of as the lack of curvature is. The reason being is the commonly accepted theoretical physics of our so-called planet and so-called universe demands constant motion. The amount of motion involved with the heliocentric theory is just mind-boggling and beyond incomprehensible. One of the reasons I named this show Static Plain Truth is to sort of avoid that stigma attached to the phrase flat Earth. And the title of the show encompasses the fact that the world doesn't move at all. When people hear static, they think of electricity, but in fact the word static technically means motionless, or to be exact, we'll just go with Webster. Static is an adjective, and the very first definition is lacking in movement, action, or change, especially in a way viewed as undesirable or uninteresting. For example, demand has grown in what was a fairly static market. Static prices, and an antonym would be variable. Then the second definition is physics concerned with bodies at rest or forces in equilibrium. So I find this all rather amusing because physics is literally the study of bodies in motion. So how ironic could something possibly be where the world is full of very brilliant, educated physicists, theoretical or otherwise, who never really took the time to apply their specialty to the very ground which they've always walked upon. The amount of pre-programming that goes into our worldview is so pervasive and begins at such a young age that we unwittingly see and experience what we believe to be possible as opposed to objectively studying what we actually see and experience. Just as proving the world or vast stretches of standing water don't curve as they should if the Earth was indeed a sphere, this conclusively shows that all theoretical physics branching from the heliocentric hypothesis are unfounded and therefore null and void. So too is the fact that the world is demonstrably stationary or static. In other words, proving the world to be stationary is 100% conclusive evidence to demolish the same theoretical physics branching from the heliocentric hypothesis. Just to name a few really important points showing the world to be static are the North Pole star Polaris, the lack of disparity in terms of centrifugal forces at the poles versus at the equator, which should be infinite, the disparity that is. And one of my favorites, I call it the Jeranism effect, which is just such a blatant, obvious problem with the heliocentric model, yet somehow all of the pro-ball astronomers totally missed this for hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, won't they feel stupid when they realize how simply and completely the heliocentric hypothesis is discredited and debunked? Now, first off, and this is a big one, the North Pole star Polaris remains fixed above the magnetic North Pole, also known as the axis of rotation in the hypothetical non-existing spherical Earth model. Polaris is supposedly 433.8 light years away, which converted into miles renders a number which I honestly don't even know how to read, or more easily converted into the theoretical astronomical unit. So 1 AU, or 1 astronomical unit, is the theoretical distance from the Earth to the Sun in the heliocentric model, or about 93 million miles. So if 1 AU equals 93 million miles, Polaris is 27,433,979 times further than the Sun is from the Earth, or 27.4 million astronomical units, which is just, you can't even fathom that. Now, and we really can't blow past this number.
You say that to people, though, and they're like, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Right, right.
No, really, think about it.
So if you consider the fact that the Earth's axis is supposedly fixed to a point in the same direction at all times, it still makes zero sense that we could have a single star above that axis given the motion and the changing angles involved with the spherical Earth hypothesis. So to break this down in basic terms, the Earth supposedly spins on its axis once per 24 hours, orbits the Sun at about 66,600 miles an hour, and the Earth and Moon supposedly orbit the Sun around essentially the same plane. It's called the ecliptic. Keep that in mind. Now, while the Earth and the Moon and most of the other planets allegedly orbit the Sun around this ecliptic, the Sun is supposedly racing around the center of the galaxy at nearly 500,000 miles an hour along a different dimension regarding Polaris. The same sort of thing applies here. The fact is, it's so blatantly obvious, it's astonishing to me because none of the brilliant astronomers throughout history noticed this glaring problem with the heliocentric model. If the Earth is orbiting the Sun at a 60-degree angle to the Sun's path around the galactic center, or the galactic equator, then half of each year visible space should be, say, northwest of the galactic equator, and 6 months later visible space would be southeast of the galactic equator. You can model this out, it's pretty obvious. Now, this means that the entire world should see a unique set of stars at night during each season, and as the Sun slowly makes its way around the theoretical curve around the galactic center, our angle of attack towards visible space should be slightly different from year to year. And we should discover unique stars and constellations every few generations due to the mechanisms or the nuts and bolts of the heliocentric system. The obvious fact is the stars go around Polaris in a perfect, predictable cycle. Eclipses occur in perfect, predictable cycles. Even as a child, I found this all very hard to swallow from a heliocentric standpoint. And the more you learn, the more and more you learn about the heliocentric model and the accepted version of reality, the more preposterous it seems to get. For example, I always assumed that the planets had sort of a chaotic orbit, just based on the amount of motion involved and the nature of what gravity is supposed to do. Gravity is supposed to be sucking in towards the Sun at all directions evenly. So seriously, how can all the planets remain neatly fixed to the ecliptic, set into the galactic plane or the path of the Sun's travel at a 60-degree angle, going around in circles around the Sun, as the Sun travels nearly perpendicular to the orbital path of the planets at almost 500,000 miles an hour? If gravity was indeed this central sucking or central pulling force towards the center of the sun, you would expect all sorts of wild acrobatics from the so-called planets in their orbit due to the motion involved. But of course, gravity somehow allows for the impossible to occur, out of line with logic, physics, and common sense, yet again. So this whole situation just oozes irony to me, as the theoretical physicists throughout history have been mathematically brilliant, imaginative, and persuasive, yet lack simple common sense, it would seem. The scientific paradigm, or scientism, has an Achilles heel, which is simple logic and common sense. So, with that, let's open it up to the panel, and I did, we gained a Fran Anderson and a Jason. So we'll start with Fran. How you been, Fran? And Fran,
I had my mic muted. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great. How you been?
I've been good, thank you. Really glad I got the invite this time. I haven't been getting the links.
Yeah, I had a few people complaining. I think Google's messing with me because when you start a Google Hangout, you can send out invites through the Hangout, and it always worked before. But yeah, I had a few people complaining that they weren't getting them, so I've changed my strategy, and I'll just manually email the links out from now on. But I'm glad you made it. What you been up to? You got any videos coming out, or did I miss your last one? It's been a while since I talked to you.
No, you haven't missed any. I'm just working on a new one. You know, they take me a while to make, and I took a break for a while. I kind of needed to just step away for a little bit because I think everybody knows how obsessed I can be, and it was kind of taking over my life, and I kind of just needed to step back for a while. But I am working on another video, and it's called, well,
disparity between the poles and the equator in terms of centrifugal force or spinning. Because the Earth supposedly spins once per 24 hours, people argue that the RPMs, or rotations per minute, isn't high enough to generate any significant centrifugal force. This is obviously hogwash, as an observer standing at the equator would theoretically be racing due east at 1,037.5 miles per hour. It's much faster than the speed of sound, while simultaneously dropping vertically at about 135 miles an hour. Gravity would need to be extremely powerful to negate such a dramatic centrifugal force. Can you possibly imagine trying to walk around on the sides of an upright spinning sphere? It would be impossible without some fairly sturdy change fastening us to such a rotating frame of reference. So we take for granted that gravity is this imaginary theoretical force which allows for such a breach in logic and physical laws as to walk around on the side of an upright spinning sphere. But what about the poles? What should the disparity be between the equator and the poles in terms of this non-existing centrifugal force? Well, at the equator, the observer, again, is perpendicular to the axis of rotation, theoretically, nearly 4,000 miles from the supposed axis beneath their feet, zipping east over 1,000 miles an hour, and vertically falling 135 miles an hour. Now, if gravity is supposedly applying itself evenly to all points of this theoretical sphere, then how does that affect a similar observer at the North Pole, for example? At the North Pole, the observer would theoretically be standing on top of the axis, parallel with the axis, and spinning exactly, well, half the speed as the hour hand on a clock. Now, many mathematicians have attempted to apologize for this lack of disparity in centrifugal forces between the two locations by using lengthy formulas and equations to show that the disparity between these two locations wouldn't be all that great. It would be minuscule. And the reason they do this is because there is indeed a minor difference in weight on a scale. You know, if you take a 1-pound object at the equator, it'll weigh a little bit less there than it does at the North Pole. Now, this happens to be directly in line with barometric pressure. The barometric pressure in the north, or the center, is much higher than it is at the equator, and this is measurable. Barometric pressure is highest in the north, gradually diminishing as you approach the equator, and continues to decrease past the equator way to the southernmost latitudes. Now, this minor fact is a pretty big problem for the globe Earth. because you would expect to see some sort of bilateral symmetry between, the North Pole and the South Pole, or like a mirror image from the southernmost areas to the northernmost areas. However, this is obviously not the case, in terms of barometric pressure at least. Now, far northern summers are much warmer, the winters are milder, and the permafrost is essentially nothing compared to that of the South, which is massive glaciers and permafrost that never goes away. The South Pole, with its extremely low barometric pressure, is colder on average and by record than the North. So, furthermore, there's no indigenous wildlife except for possibly penguins in the South. The South polar area is absolutely not in bilateral symmetry with the North, which again is just sort of a little problem for the globe Earth hypothesis, as we should see very similar climates in the North Polar region and the South. Finally, and I'm almost done with my little monologue here, but visible space from winter to summer, using the same basic geometry and logic that different supposed plane in the ecliptic, roughly adhering to the so-called theoretical galactic plane or galactic equator. So at this point we have two planes of orbit, the ecliptic or solar plane and the galactic equator or the galactic plane. Now here's the kicker. The ecliptic plane, that's where the Earth supposedly goes around the Sun, according to mainstream physics is set into the galactic plane at a 60-degree angle. Now, I really have a hard time understanding how the ecliptic remains at a 60-degree angle to the galactic plane, or the path of the Sun around the galactic plane. It's as if all the laws of motion and physics, inertia, conservation of energy, momentum, all of these laws must be sort of broken in order to allow for the theoretical galaxy and orbital mechanics of our little theoretical solar system to be possible. In fact, such things are impossible, but that isn't even the point. The point is, for half of each year, visible space should be north of the galactic equator, and the other half of the year, visible space should be south of the galactic equator. Furthermore, the supposed alleged axis of the Earth is purportedly regressing in a great circle over about 26,000 years. This is what they claim is responsible for precession of the equinoxes. Now, this means that the supposed axis of rotation of the world should be constantly phasing away from one North Star towards another. There's no possible way for a single star to remain fixed above this theoretical axis for more than 50 or 100 years at the very most. The fact is that the North Star has been fixed in its very same spot for all of modern recorded history. Are we to believe that the North Star travels trillions of light years every year just to remain fixed above our North Pole? No, the Earth is stationary, and the apparent stars are apparently moving overhead just as they appear to be. Now, just to cap this point off, the galaxy itself, along with all the other motion described previously, is supposedly traveling some millions of miles per hour through the cosmos, yet we never see any minute change in the perfectly predictable, perfectly cyclical cycles of the stars in the sky, which never change one iota, not a bit. We should so obviously see changes from season to season due to the angles involved with visible space and this whole heliocentric mishmash of crap, but we'll get back to this in a bit. The shameful truth is the North Star's stationary behavior completely falsifies the heliocentric model, as it would be physically impossible to have a single star remain above our alleged axis for any significant amount of time. Now, a few more quick points about Polaris. One is the fact that an observer anywhere in the northern hemisphere, or central semiplane, can view the North Star Polaris at all times, as long as it's nighttime. The same cannot be said about a single star or even entire constellations in the south. Also, Polaris has been documented as visible from as far south as the Tropic of Capricorn. This would be physically impossible if the Earth was a sphere, as an observer's line of sight towards the heavens would be a tangent to the curve of the Earth, and Polaris should not be visible south of the equator at all. And so we have yet another very important verifiable proof that the heliocentric model is dead wrong. Now, another important point about this world being stationary, I mentioned this real quick, is the lack of disparity in centrifugal force at the equator versus the poles. This is yet another physical impossibility involved with the globe Earth. It's the lack of